Very welcome to our Train the Trainer workshop today, where we are looking at gender sensitivity in coaching, training and mentoring. My name is Helena Dean, and I am from Westvic, which is a business innovation center based in the west of Ireland, and whose mission is to work with startups and SME in the startup scale-up space, but we also run specific entrepreneurship-related programs that deal with more mature SMEs and regional development issues. So about the training contents today, we will go firstly through an introduction to explain a little bit about the objectives, approach and expected outcomes of the training today. We will give you a little bit of background on the W-Power project, just to understand how this training fits in with the remit of the project. We will also look at the motivation for this training from the gender perspective, and we will look at some framework and definitions just to give a little bit of context and background before diving deeper into the issue of inclusion of gender sensitivity. We are going to touch briefly on the policy context, and then we're going to go into the practical elements of the training, which is to consider the building blocks of a gender-sensitive business support model, look at the factors of influence and tools for inclusion of gender sensitivity in business support. And then we're going to look at the continuous improvement principle. Now, about the introduction and the objectives, approach and expected outcomes. I want to highlight that this is a very complex area, and my own background is that of a business practitioner. That is to say, in my daily job, I provide business support to companies and individual entrepreneurs, so that the training is very much coming from that angle. And while there is appreciation of the sort of academic body of research that there is available on this and related topics regarding to issues of gender equality, this will be based very much on the business practitioner point of view. So the general objectives as identified in our project is to help improve coaching, mentoring, training, support provision to be provided in a more gender equal way. And I will explain a little bit later when we talk about the framework and definitions, what does this exactly mean. Also, because this is an international partnership that is involved in provision of this training, one of the aims is to share transnational benchmarks, best practices and findings from latest research. And again, when a little bit later, I will provide a little bit more detail around that. So ultimately, what we are trying to achieve is to help remove barriers and lower the threshold for rural women to consider entrepreneurship as an option. And making the business provision or molding the business provision in a more gender equal way is one of the strategies or one of the means of helping achieve that. In a more broader context of objectives, so not strictly tied down to the motivation that we have highlighted in our project, it is to help business advisors understand gender and entrepreneurship issue and make them more sensitive towards the gender dimension of entrepreneurship and in entrepreneurship. And again, as I said, this is a complex area and can mean a lot of things. So we will break this down into sort of bite-sized chunks later on, so that hopefully you will be able to appreciate what is meant by that. It is also to help business advisors include the gender dimension throughout a business support service. And again, we will explain exactly what we mean by that. To indicate how to design a more gender sensitive business support. So again, this is towards the spirit of improving the business supports so that they are more inclusive of the gender dimension, and help to eliminate gender bias in business supports. And in terms of gender bias, again, there is a lot of research on gender bias in entrepreneurship supports and so on. And I'm sure a lot of business practitioners who are with us today are fully aware of some inequalities that are highlighted in the provision and access to supports by female entrepreneurs in particular. So the approach for today's training, and indeed towards the gender sensitive tools, is that it has to be suitable for localization. So as said, we have an international audience here today with us, and the learning and the tools provided by this training are aimed at a diverse range of countries, and local elements have to be taken into account. So, for example, I mentioned language, the fact that some of us are native English speakers and some of us are not. So the whole sort of training content has to be able to be easily translated and adapted to any local sort of circumstances and factors. It has to be pragmatic and practitioner orientated, because this is our primary audience: business practitioners, coaching experts, mentors, training providers. So it is, it cannot be too complicated, and it cannot be it cannot be too theoretical, because at the end of the day, we want people to be able to use these materials and to be able to apply them in their day-to-day. So the concepts is presented in bite-sized building blocks. So we're going to try and take this complex area and break it down into several sort of areas and steps, and sort of hope to stimulate the thinking around all the issues that we are covering today. So I have to recognize that, again, some of our participants might be at an entry level, and the training is pretty much geared towards somebody that might not have, same as me, had any involvement in the whole issue around promoting inclusion of gender issues in entrepreneurship support design, or in any of those areas. So that we are starting with some sort of basic ideas, and hopefully the people in our audience today that are at a more mature, more experienced level will still find some nuggets of information and some useful building blocks, as we say here, to improve on the level that they're already at. So again, as mentioned, simple, easy to use tools, again, with the hope that that will facilitate their adaptation, and that will also facilitate the ease of sharing the knowledge that we are presenting here today with other business practitioners in localities and maybe colleagues and co-workers as well. So the target audience, which I already mentioned, are primarily business advisors and business support organizations, as well as coaching professionals, mentors, and trainers. So we recognize that, you know, that there is a lot of privately run coaching companies out there, as well as mentors and trainers, which work with the business support organizations to deliver supports and services. So this training program is equally aimed at both, but also existing and potential entrepreneurs, because in the spirit of the open innovation and the quadruple helix, we do want their involvement in the whole process, and their input indeed is really, really vital to applying the gender sensitivity in a meaningful way. And again, this is something that we will again talk about further in the workshop. So expected outcomes, what are we hoping to achieve? So obviously, number one, primary objective is to increase access to gender sensitive and diversity observing business advisory services. So this has been identified quite clearly as an area that might be underserved and in some ways underdeveloped, whereas there is a huge body of research and tools and studies in other areas of gender sensitivity, such as gender sensitivity in the workplace or gender sensitivity in sports. There just isn't the same amount of available resources for entrepreneurship and in particular business supports. So increase in uptake of entrepreneurship by women in rural areas. This will be then an indirect consequence of the training, that by providing a larger diverse range of business supports, which are more gender sensitive, that this will enable more female entrepreneurs to engage basically with those supports. But having said that, we are aiming, of course, to engage both genders. So this is not only aimed at female entrepreneurs, but it is in recognition that the realities of engaging in entrepreneurship are different between the two genders. So it also will contribute to the capacity building of business advisors, coaches, mentors, trainers, and female entrepreneurs. So it's all about sharing knowledge, increasing knowledge, and again, we hope this to be a continuous cycle, and that what we shared here today will be cascaded to other groups of people. So just a little bit of background about the W-Power project, and to explain why we are involved in this area of training. So we are a project co-funded by Interreg for Northern Periphery and Arctic. So the idea is that all our regions face common challenges in terms of stimulating female entrepreneurship in what are sparsely populated rural areas. So the project objectives are in the main to enhance the capacity building, to improve the gender-related business advisory services, which is what we're doing today, encourage self-employment, and this is based on actual needs, joint collaboration, close engagement with key stakeholders. So there is a lot of original research that has been done as part of the project, which again can be accessed in our publications site on the page on the website. And this is important because there is a lot of, again, location-specific information around, for example, need analysis and benchmarking. So this is part of one of the main work packages, so gender-sensitive coaching concept, was said because it made sense to expand the scope of the training to also really look at mentoring and training because the principles that we are introducing today can be also applied to those areas. So while the original thought was around the coaching concept specifically, the learning today can be applied also to those other areas. So the Northern Periphery and Arctic partnership that we have in this project is led by Karelia, University of Applied Sciences. So we are a mix of academia, business orientated organizations, business support organizations such as Structure and Westbeek Innovation Center Iceland, and we also have an entrepreneurial entity in our project composition, and as well as a Canadian partner, which is Women in Business Network. So there's a good mix of different points of view, different experiences and different skill sets in the project, which is also fed into this training session today. So the partners are from Iceland, Sweden, Finland, Scotland, Shetland, and of course West of Ireland. So and Canada. So there's a good geographical mix, and as I said, this is why a lot of our audience today is international. So motivation for this training is that it's in part driven by the EU policy-driven objectives, but also by the individual missions of the partners that are involved in the project. So entrepreneurial education and training are really important to support growth and business creation. So this is a given. So there is the need to strengthen the framework conditions. So this is for entrepreneurs of both genders, but by removing existing barriers and supporting them all throughout the business life cycle. So from a conception stage, from idea to prototyping, to proof of customer traction, growth, and so on. So all of this is also aligned with our mission to stimulate the culture of entrepreneurship in Europe and nurture the new generation of entrepreneurs. So these are, I think, very familiar concepts that sort of happen to also align with our regional strategies. So here to talk about implementing national strategies for women's entrepreneurship, but in the spirit of the W-Power project, what we are specifically looking at is the additional challenges that are location specific, so rural, sparsely populated communities, and how to increase the share of women-led companies in so away from the urban areas where the challenges might be slightly different. So help the female entrepreneurs connect to each other, learn from each other, act as role models for each other, and as ambassadors of female entrepreneurship, and implement policies that enable women to achieve an adequate work-life balance, which is also a very relevant topic when entrepreneurship is considered with also demands of family life. So the headline is promoting women's entrepreneurship is a long-term process that requires time to change structures and attitudes in society. And the reason this is highlighted on its own, it's just to recognize that the content today, again, is a boilerplate, a start, maybe a baseline to developing a longer-term strategy of dealing with the issue of gender sensitivity in business support provision. And the reason for that is that the bias, some of which are conscious and some of which are unconscious, need to be addressed over time, or they cannot all be addressed in a single shot. It's a evolving process. It's a gradual process. So this is just in recognition that a lot of continuous learning is needed, and continuous revisiting of this issue in terms of achieving that golden standard of gender neutrality in business support provision, or indeed any other area. So while, so we hope that today is maybe a start for some, maybe middle of the journey for others, but it's just in recognition that it's a long-term journey. And where I sort of draw comparison with this is the climate issues, where gradually people's consciousness around these issues, which are becoming more visible, more mainstream, more second nature as time goes on, that this is sort of the same principle about gender, where we need to change our way of thinking, where we are conditioned and pre-programmed to think a certain way, to get to the stage where these things happen naturally and automatically and don't require a lot of effort. But this is in recognition that we're not in that stage yet, and that we need to remind ourselves of the issues that we need to integrate in order to then develop better standards in gender sensitivity. So obviously we as a project, we support the implementation of EU and national policies that relate to this area. We do so, as mentioned, also taking into account the localization issues. So there are some specifics that will need to be taken in account by each local partner when considering the gender sensitivity issue. So gender can have many, obviously, definitions or way of looking at that aspect, but generally what we mean to say that it differs from focusing on the biological traits of a person. It's about the societal role, it's about what defines their role in business. So it's the roles, activities, responsibilities, characteristics. So the first step is the recognition that these aspects are different for each gender. So the norms, roles, stereotypes determine the perception and how they're expected to act, but also that means in turn that the way, coming back to our topic, that the way in which business supports function are based on these perhaps stereotypes, or just that consciousness of these differences isn't entirely there. So integrating gender dimension in entrepreneurial business support is, of course, a benefit. So doing it, as we mentioned, in our objectives and our expected outcomes means that there can be a holistic approach, that it can be an inclusive approach. That means that everybody's needs are addressed equally. So that means both genders, not only one or the other. And this is what I said about reprogramming, about rethinking standards and reference models. So the unconscious bias, of course, means that we are not aware that we are being biased. So when you are perhaps designing a program or implementing a program, you would not necessarily be aware that you are incorporating an element that might provide either restricted access or that might not address the needs equally of both genders. So this is why we need these tools to help us recondition our approach. So in-depth understanding of both genders' needs, behaviors, and attitudes. So as I said, this is an ongoing process, and it helps understand from the societal point of view what the contributions are from female entrepreneurs and how to help them diversify the range of products and services, because again, because of the gender-specific differences, female entrepreneurs can complement and add different aspects to the mix of products and services that are out there, but they can also provide unique customer insights, for example. So the inputs that have shaped today's training session are examples from global research, case studies, formal research, and best practice studies. So it's a very internationalized point of view that's been incorporated. So there was a lot of things that were considered from many different points of view, and also geographically, and I would like to say thank you at this stage to the partners. This was definitely a partnership effort where a lot of examples of best practice, of what's there, what's missing, what training might be available, what sort of knowledge is available, was all shared between the partnership and was sort of distilled to the points that we're covering here. So, so challenges were in particular, just to highlight very briefly, that as I mentioned a little bit earlier, entrepreneurship is an area that's not as extensively covered by the studies or the bodies of research, or indeed statistics or what have you that are out there. So a lot of learning was actually gathered from other areas where there is quite a lot of evidence-based research already completed. So for example, gender in research, gender in the workplace, gender in sports, gender in military. So there are some of the areas where there was a lot of material available, whereas in the entrepreneurship there was, curiously enough, and definitely not in the area of gender sensitive coaching or gender sensitive business supports. There was precious little available. No common language and common understanding of terms. I found this, that there is a lot of terminology that is being used interchangeably, and it is not always clear in a discussion, you know, what does this mean versus some other term that sounds similar but is something else, and so on. So the need to understand the language and to understand how it is used. So when you are looking, for example, for some materials in a certain area, that you know that you can determine whether that's the same thing or something different, or what area is meant to cover. So that's what I said, gender in the workplace versus gender in research versus gender entrepreneurship. So obviously the issues, the overlying issues are common, but because of the dynamic of entrepreneurship and because of the relationship in the business support ecosystem, there is still some adaptation that is needed and some specific consideration that have specifically to do with business support that have to be considered here. And then, as I said, coaching versus mentoring versus training versus business supports. Again, you know, they are all slightly different, but the principles of applying gender sensitivity to those areas can be used on a common level. So gender and gender sensitivity framework and definitions. So this is where we dive into the wonderful world of gender vocabulary. So first, to recognize, as I said, that gender issues have a real impact on potential and existing female entrepreneurs. And this is well documented, and I'm sure all of you would have read about statistics about the lower rate of female entrepreneurs versus male entrepreneurs, issues in accessing capital, issues in accessing resources, lower uptake of certain business supports, and so on, which all act as constraints. So it's limiting their behavior, so they can be sometimes be documented as being less successful on average, and it also constrains the opportunities. So the potential that this group of entrepreneurs have is not fully exploited. So this is a collage of various expressions that I am sure you would have come across, and that can be slightly confusing when trying to discern what sort of strategy you should adopt, how you should formulate your strategy with regards to gender, how you should approach the problematic in general. So we all heard of, you know, gender awareness, gender sensitivity, diversity, bias, equality, inclusivity, the gender dimension, gender balance, gender mainstreaming, and as I said, the temptation is there to use them interchangeably, but they do actually mean quite different things. So as a starting point, I will just briefly explain why is it important to distinguish between all of these. So I'll start with the gender bias. So gender bias is defined as a preference or prejudice towards one gender over the other. Bias can be conscious or unconscious. So I mentioned the bias a few times already. So this is an important starting point, because defining what the gender bias are is the starting point in arriving at your strategy for gender sensitivity. So that's sort of the underlying cause that we are, or the underlying reason why we engage in strategies to address this. So gender bias is the outgoing point. So gender equality, the state in which access to rights or opportunities unaffected by gender. So where gender bias is the cause of, or the root of all evil, gender equality is the target outcome. So this is where we want to arrive at. So we combat gender bias to arrive at gender equality. Gender balance is gender equality, but on a different side of the medallion. So it's an equitable distribution of opportunities and resources between women and men, and or the equal representation of women and men. And again, this is a target outcome, if you like, but by achieving gender balance, you also move towards gender equality. Then we have gender diversity, which is an equitable or fair representation of people of different genders. So gender diversity goes hand in hand with gender balance, and it's again one of the desired outcomes. The gender inclusivity, on the other hand, is the line of thought that until gender neutrality is achieved, or which is gender equality in another guise, policies, programs, language, any sort of intervention of any kind needs to include the fluidity of gender expression orientation versus stereotypes or roles based on perceived or actual biological sex. So while gender inclusivity is slightly more turned, rather than the social or definition, it's more closely linked to also the biological definitions and stereotypes. It is still an important distinction to know that gender inclusivity is a strategy that leads to the outcome of gender equality and gender balance. So some of the terms on this canvas are strategies that lead to the outcomes, and some of them obviously are the ultimate objective. So gender awareness is recognition that there's real differences between women and men. So in terms of life experiences, expectations, needs. So if you're gender aware, that is, or becoming gender aware is again a strategy or tool towards the ultimate goal of achieving gender equality and gender balance. But also gender awareness, same as appreciation and recognition of gender bias, is a stepstone to developing gender mainstreaming. And mainstreaming, by what we mean by that, is that a gender equality perspective is at all stages of an intervention, guided by the needs and realities of the two genders. So why is this important in the context of business support provision is that at the moment there is a second tier of business support provision, in that a lot of business supports are designed or aimed at specifically female entrepreneurs. So there is a mainstream line of supports, and then there is a female entrepreneurship specific support. So the idea is to consolidate the two as a long-term goal, and that means that elimination of the need to have a separate track of supports for female entrepreneurs, so that by making the mainstream business support inclusive of all these aspects that at the moment mean that a separate track is needed, that all of that is included in this business support design and implementation. In other words, making it gender sensitive. So when you take your gender awareness, your gender bias, and you aim to achieve gender mainstreaming, you are developing a gender sensitive business support in essence. So you take account of societal and cultural factors. So you take your gender awareness and any sort of negative factors that require, that prevent gender mainstreaming at the minute, and you incorporate it into the business and your business support thinking. So this gives the business support the gender dimension. So integrating the sex and gender analysis into an intervention. So this is an EU, again, coined expression, gender dimension, But really what it means is that you take all your processes of development, when you consider providing support, when you think of your cycle of research and cycle of needs analysis and cycle of design, etc., that you utilize in your day-to-day as a business support organization, now that you also include the gender dimension. So when you're considering X, Y, and Z, is that you have also this extra additional layer of consideration of issues, so that you're taking into account gender bias, that you're taking elements of your gender awareness in order to make your business support provision gender sensitive, which in the longer term will lead to gender mainstreaming, equality, balance. So, as said, the awareness and the recognition of bias is sort of an important first step. So, the recognition, but also understanding of the different needs and wants and different expectations is really, really important. And so if in the contrast to gender sensitivity, if you are not taking into account these factors, then you are operating what we refer as a gender blind manner. So this the aim of gender sensitivity, which is, say, a set to gender mainstreaming, is to solve these, which is said sometimes due to unconscious bias, or sometimes hidden gender inequalities, and are sometimes inequalities that we might not be strictly aware of, as I said, due to the conditioning and programming, and due to our just general need to expand our awareness of these issues. So the ability to acknowledge and highlight these differences, issues, and inequalities, and incorporate this into strategies and actions is what gender sensitivity is all about. So I will just briefly touch on this just to say there is a policy context to all of this. Gender mainstreaming is a recognized policy issue. So it is something that is being considered on quite a high level, and what we're trying to do is distill this, as I say, which is a complex issue, distill it down to a practitioner's point of view. And just as a background, just as a context, to recognize why is it that we're doing it, what are we sort of trying to achieve, is just to give this little snippet of the policy background and the thinking of where is all this sort of fitting in terms of maybe a national strategy, but also sort of in the context of Europe. So the idea is that gender mainstreaming will benefit both women and men, and it will not increase inequality, but it will enhance gender equality. So as said, gender equality is sort of the ultimate goal, that gender sensitivity is one type of strategy that leads to that long-term goal. So in the context of the training of women entrepreneurs, this sensitization and awareness aspect, as I said, are really important, and they are sort of the basics from where everything else develops out of. So, as said, what we are saying is that there's no point in the long term in continuing to develop entrepreneurial skills of women and men separately. So in a sort of two-track business support provision, we want to create non-segregated learning environments, because this also benefits to achieving a greater mix of men and women entrepreneurs in terms of interactive peer learning. So while you know, we have evidence of many, for example, female-based peer networks working really well, the idea is that in the long term we could transition to more sort of holistic, more inclusive models of peer support. So the project formulation, or formulation of a coaching concept, or formulation of an entrepreneurial program should therefore be driven by the quest to ensure that there is equal access, equal participation, equal benefit from any resources, services, capacity building programs, or supports that are offered. So this is just a brief recognition of the coach and mentoring training offer different forms of development support and different ways in transferring skills, knowledge, expertise. But despite, as I say, these differences in the actual execution and the actual structure of the support, the sort of thinking that is associated with the provision of each of these can be all guided by, you know, gender sensitive criteria. So just on next. So finally, moving on to the building blocks of a gender sensitive business support model. So the principles of improvement, so I said, you know, some people will be made perhaps at an entry level, and some people will already have implemented some measures of improving the gender awareness and including the learnings of gender awareness into the provision of the supports. But this is a step-by-step development. So this is not an area where they can be quick wins, or, you know, half an hour of this and you're done. It's not the type of issue that can be addressed quickly and in one in a single shot, let's call it. So it requires a long-term commitment. It requires incremental approach. So it will not be possible to, you know, turn around completely the business provision in a week or anything like that. It has to be recognized that this is a process that will take time, and that will need involvement from various groups of people, not least the target audience, the entrepreneurs, and other stakeholders, and that it is something that, you know, gender mainstreaming is something that will be ultimately achieved, but as I said, will take time. It's a journey. It will require active engagement of practitioners, obviously, also peer learning among practitioners nationally and transnationally, and it will require a balanced and inclusive approach, as I say, to step away from that gender segregation issue we have now in business provision, and prevent discrimination of some social groups. So what this means in terms of discrimination of some social groups is also the recognition that, you know, there might be some sort of segmentation socially in your target audience. So, for example, that can be consideration of the needs of, say, Sami and indigenous female entrepreneurs, which might need, again, slightly different consideration. Or perhaps when we're thinking about Ireland, the special challenges faced by maybe the traveller female entrepreneurship group. So it is considering the gender, but also the social groups within within the gender. So awareness raising, advocacy, and information sharing are critical success factors. So it's important that none of this is done in isolation. So if you are a business support organization and you're getting involved on this journey of inclusion of gender sensitivity in the areas of business support, this is something, again, because of the complexity of the issue that requires constant and regular exchange with other people, and this will then lead to shortening the learning curve, because obviously attempting this in isolation means, of course, that the learning path will be longer, and the exchange and so on can lead to some collective learning, collective outcomes that can provide some answers more quickly. So that's why I have my little infinity symbol there. So in gender sensitive business supports, gender is consistently taken into account throughout the business support cycle. So it's that if you are aiming to be gender sensitive, at every step of the way, you have to go and review and check, have you taken into account the gender sensitivity issue. So the principles is that that drives this is that we want to encourage an increase in women's participation in entrepreneurship, or indeed in accessing any of the business supports, and that we want to be certain that women's needs as well as men's are covered, and that these include the realities that the women and men face. So this can include realities that we need to be aware of that might have an impact, for example, in terms of, as mentioned before, the work family balance and the realities of that, realities of childcare, for example. And so it's again quite a complex area, and there's many factors. Research on the gender question. We throw back again to the sharing, collective learning, exchange. Enhancing the understanding of gender issue should be promoted. So I will come back to this point again in a minute. And this is to facilitate the whole process of moving towards gender mainstream business support. So we mentioned the building blocks. So this is, say, an adaptation from some of the best practices out there, some of the methods and strategies that have been used in other areas, but adapted basically to the business support provision and the entrepreneurial topics. So as any good house, a good house needs good foundations, good solid foundations. So establishing the baseline is probably the most sort of labor intensive phase or amount of work that needs to be done in order to progress to the next stages. So there is no expectation, as I said, because this is a long-term, step-by-step process, that the baseline will be completely established, or that all the elements of a baseline will be covered in one go. This will again be an ongoing process, purely because what you do in the baseline, during the baseline stage, is identify some of the factors of influence that will determine what consideration you need to give to gender sensitivity in this later stages, where you are developing the approach of your intervention, where you're developing the content of your intervention, and where you are implementing it. And then there is a continuous loop, and again I will dive a little bit deeper into the philosophy of that and how to do that. That means that you're constantly evaluating and feeding the evaluation back into the your system here. So factors of influence. So this is where you start, and these are the items that can be location specific in determining your baseline. So this has been taken from the Durham Business School concept that every entrepreneur, regardless of gender, has 4 personal factors that will influence the success. So the 4 ingredients of success on the entrepreneurial level, which include motivation and commitment, abilities and skills, ideas and markets, and resources. So that can include access to resources, access to ideas and markets. It can include the types of abilities and skills ones have, and the level of motivation, commitment, which can also be influenced by external factors. So that is on the entrepreneurial level. And then we have 4 external factors that influence the success of entrepreneurs. So these are factors, let's say, outside of the, definitely outside of the control of the entrepreneur. So one of them is business development organization. So this is what we're talking about today. So this includes the types of business support that are provided, the types of stimuli, the types of promotion and everything else. The socio-cultural context, we touched on this. So again, this can be definitely very location specific, and which will determine the constraints and opportunities that entrepreneurs, any entrepreneur will face in terms of developing own business. The broader enabling environment refers to the legal, regulatory kind of policy framework of what is out there, and there are quite clear examples of that, how that can encourage or discourage entrepreneurship. And the general economic and market environment. So, for example, COVID obviously would fall into this external factor here, and that would also be an external factor of influence that impacts success of entrepreneurs. So when you overlay the 2, basically you are looking at all the factors that are impacting your baseline, or that will provide the context for developing your baseline. This is a sort of a research stage. It is an attempt to collate all the sort of background and context information that has an influence on the gender dimension of entrepreneurship. So because there is, as I say, we have an international audience here today, the access to resources, for example, in West of Ireland can be very different to access to resources in Iceland, and that is why it is important to analyze each one of these factors of influence and sort of understand specific to your environment, to your ecosystem, and what are the realities of male and female entrepreneurs that will define your baseline, that will give you sort of the boilerplate, the background information that you will use to contrast then your later stages of designing an intervention, of developing a methodology approach, or when you go and you think about how you're targeting support, that this is what you use to contrast each stage against. So this will give you an understanding of the reality. It will assist you in designing a strategy, program, or project. And a specific method that can be used in this phase is gender analysis. So it is important when you undertake a gender analysis that you follow the data quality principles, that you ensure that the data is valid, reliable, that it's timely, precise, and that it has integrity. So this explains a little bit about what each aspect means, and the reason the data quality is really important, because obviously bad data leads to bad decision making and so on. So it is really important when you are looking at your gender analysis that you also check against this data quality principles and ensure that you're working with good quality data. That's, for example, eliminating margins of error or narrowing the margins of error, making sure the information is current, that you're not using 10-year-old information and so on, and that it is reliable. So, you know, consider the sources and so on. So this is very important. So the training needs analysis obviously is a focal point for development of a coaching concept, for development of any type of skills-based program. So the need to research this again on a continuous basis is really important. And again, this information is something that feeds into your baseline. So this is to, again, facilitate additional elements that might be needed to move your business support more towards mainstream. So is there, you know, consideration around design, around content, around implementation elements that need to be adjusted to be inclusive of female entrepreneurs. So one of the tools we're going to provide will be a pre-assessment template. So this is not a template that is to be copy-pasted. It's just more to provide inspiration and be a starting point. Because as I said, because of the locational considerations, you will need to take into account specific factors that apply here. So it's about analyzing situation of women and men in the field, collect information and data about existing situations. So when we're talking about the gender awareness and the realities, this is the start, the external and entrepreneurial success factors. You know, you look at the statistics that are already there. So when we talked about gender analysis, you might need to collect new data. You need to complement quantitative as well as qualitative insights, so statistics as well as information from studies, maybe focus groups, academic works, any research or policy reports, and this is to gain a deeper understanding. So the bias that we talked about, so doing the research to identify gender inequalities. So again, working with the stakeholders, working with the target audience is very important here. So getting the views of entrepreneurs about maybe what is missing, what difficulty they have maybe in accessing, what difficulty they have in maybe not getting the type of support that is focusing on a specific skill or area. For example, the recent research we have done with our entrepreneurs have indicated more of a need for personal skill development or maybe business skills, and broader consideration needed for inclusion of those. So that's an example of a reality in our area. So an example of this is, you know, what are their expectations and needs and other differences between women and men. So it is important that when you are collecting data that you're doing it on a segregated gender basis, because otherwise it is not possible to compare and to understand what differences there are. So it's important when you're doing, you know, from this point on, if you want to progress towards gender sensitivity, that whatever research is done, whenever data is collected, it's done on the gender basis, so that you know, this kind of gender analysis is possible. And then you can take that information and say, okay, this is what our research has shown us. So how can that feed into, how can these different interests, roles, positions, attitudes, expectations feed into a strengthened delivery of supports that better addresses the needs of women and men. So localized inequalities, to highlight this again, is really important. Access to resources, exercising fundamental rights. So all this is a background and an influence on what, again, constraints the entrepreneurs might have because of their gender, or because, you know, of roles that may be expected of men and women in this in your locality, which may again be different. It is important then to consider norms and values that regulate the process of access and control of resources. So again, taking the 4 aspects of entrepreneurial success and 4 external factors, this needs to be contrasted against the opportunities to participate on equal terms. Now, here we talk about in all aspects of society, but really what we are interested in, opportunities to participate on equal terms in entrepreneurship and in accessing business support provision. So this means that when you are going through the process of creating greater gender awareness within your organization or within your company or as an individual, that you also take into account structure of the organization of private life. So there are different expectations in terms of women and men, and they have different positions in this area, which have consequences. So, and this positions may reinforce a challenge, might be challenged by other diversity criteria. So, as an example, again, here in Ireland, still the majority of child minding or child care is done by the maternal part of the family, and the access to childcare is a external factor that may affect the access to business support and inclusion in entrepreneurial activities. So, for example, we have governmental stimulation which allows for paid childcare for three hours a day in a preschool Montessori setting for a child that's, you know, usually between 3 and 4 or 5 years old. So that there are certain limitation, and again, awareness of those kind of constraints would enable me to take that information into account when designing business support, to make sure that potential female entrepreneurs, say, in those situations, or indeed male entrepreneurs in those situations, are still able to access the business support. And I think if you know, technology is an area that offers additional opportunities, and I think I was thinking about this today actually, that COVID has shown us how much can be done also virtually and via recorded means and so on, and that in addition to physical events, there's other modes of participation that can expand the depth of access, that can expand participation and so on, that could become more mainstream in the future. So tools for inclusion of gender sensitivity in business support. So we are suggesting a few. In addition to performing a good analysis, which again cannot be underestimated because it is a complex process, and because they have to be pragmatically and practically orientated, it can be at odds with that, and we do not want to come into a situation where it's just a tick-the-box exercise. So that's a challenge. It's always a challenge. It's a challenge of every business support organization and every business practitioner, in that you want to adopt higher standards, but again, it cannot be too complex or too complicated, because it will not work, or it will prevent full adaptation. So important balance therefore has to be struck between making tools simple enough, but not oversimplifying the issues. So this is what we have attempted to do here. So providing a visual representation of what the inclusion of gender sensitivity might look like in your day-to-day. So this is a gender sensitivity orientation wheel, and the idea is just to give a visual stimulus when you are at a certain phase of developing a business support, or when you are maybe revisiting a business support that you are providing already. How do you check, you know, how can I make it more gender sensitive? How do I check whether I have, omitted something, or can I improve, and so on. So the situational baseline phase is there to establish the influence factors for gender sensitivity that are typical for your ecosystem, your locality, the entrepreneurs you are targeting specifically. So be it regional level, be it local level, be it national level, you have to do this research phase, which is all about, if you don't already have that gender awareness level, that you build your knowledge and your capacity in that area. And then going around the wheel, so there are some issues marked in white, which are more typical for business support organizations. So if you're an individual business practitioner, so say if you're a coaching expert or a training provider, then those might not be relevant for you. But if you are a business support organization, in addition to looking at the actual provision of business support, you might want to also make sure that the team implementing those, that the team designing those, and the team that is doing the sort of background research work and so on is also gender balanced. So from your gender analysis, you can develop your own gender sensitive check list based on the baseline, which you can then apply. So for example, when you're looking maybe at the start of the year, or whenever your usual cycle is of review of what sort of business support are you going to provide, what the content of that is going to be when you're just developing your approach, that you can a checklist that you are being gender sensitive, and that you're formulating it also in a gender sensitive way. The gender sensitive methodology then developed at this stage would be used in your content development phase, and one of the other sort of consideration is to remember to use gender impartial language, for example, when you are developing the content. a business support organization specific issue here may be that you might be outsourcing the actual implementation or delivery of support. So in that case, to consider that when you're going to the tender and selection process of a support provider, that you are doing so in a gender balanced way, but also, if possible, that if you're working with a panel of providers, that you ensure that they are trained in gender sensitivity, and that therefore there isn't a broken chain, you know, that the efforts put in the earlier stages of preparation are not sort of lost because at the implementation stage there just isn't that follow through. So again, in the implementation, in the way the content is delivered, in the way the participants are engaged, the way that the event is marketed and promoted, again, it is worth going back and over the baseline, and you can develop a separate checklist or use the original checklist that you had to make sure, have I considered the gender angle here to, you know, to the extent possible. So monitoring and managing gender equality, again, this is something that would be more typical for a business support organization that has resources that can look into that rather than an individual, maybe business practitioner. And then making sure that the outcomes of any business support program or once it's finished is promoted also in a gender sensitive way. And this ties in with the gender sensitivity checklist that I mentioned. So for each phase, and again, I'm going to provide an example, which will be a resource, which again is to provide an example and an inspiration to structure your own checklist. You know, and it's just kind of asking yourself a series of questions. You know, have you in the baseline phase, have you considered, you know, the gender awareness, gender bias factors? So this is again just a couple of examples of what that question might look like. You know, for example, have you identified sex discriminated baseline as an indicator and specific targets that will enable you to, you know, follow the progress over time? Are you encouraging target stakeholders? The gender analysis that you have done, did you have a look at what impact this will have on different groups? Are you using the gender neutral language? Are you stimulating participation of all gender? And again, this will tie in with your local factors where reaching your target group may require different approaches. The framework, including gender responsive indicators, targets, baseline to monitor gender equality results, you know, have they been included? And then in implementation phase, things like we said, for example, making sure that you've considered the private life factors that might apply, and again, ability to provide inputs, access, project activities or support activities and participate in them. So this is again just an example, and you will have the opportunity to sort of use the resources that we give you so for more detailed organization. So a lot of this is a lot of work. So continuous improvement principle. This is a really important part, and if you recall the building blocks and the thought that this is a continuous step-by-step development process, is that this is that every iteration of your business support can lead you to a place of greater gender sensitivity. So as I said, it's not an overnight process. It's not an instantaneous process. It is very important to kind of reevaluate, constantly and to kind of build step by step towards that long-term goal of gender mainstreaming and gender equality. So as said, an important part of that is sharing the knowledge. We give here a suggestion that you should share it with institutions and departments that focus on gender. And they can, in turn, provide feedback to you. So we are talking about implementing this continuous improvement cycle where you implement, evaluate, share and learn and improve, so that hopefully each future version can be that little bit more gender sensitive, that little bit more inclusive of gender awareness, that little bit closer to gender equality. So as I said, it's not a black and white process. It's not you either doing it or you're not doing it, in the sense that the factors are so many that you might just want to start with one area and then gradually start including other areas. So the strategy is totally up to you, but it is difficult to attempt to include the gender awareness criteria that you have identified in your baseline all in one go. So it may say require sort of long-term commitment to reiterating. So the ex-ante evaluation, analysis, assessment, which can take form of either focus group interviews or surveys or questionnaires or whatever, is to assess, did the program, project, coaching concept maintain or increase the gender inequalities. So it is important to measure this again on an ongoing basis, also to be able to determine whether there was any positive or negative changes and what factors and strategies contributed to those changes, so that you can again adjust your gender sensitivity strategy according to those results. So again, in the resources, we'll give a post-assessment questionnaire example, which is again should make it possible to detect different realities of men and women and to help avoid gender biases going forward. So again, it'll be an example and you can build your own to fit the type of business support you are providing and to fit also the content and implementation that was undertaken. So again, this is important to ensure also equal participation in the post-assessment phase. So we need again to collect data that is gender segregated in order to be able to assess that impact on both genders, but also any positive or negative elements. So next steps from here, I will be sending an evaluation survey about the content of today's training, just as I said, to get a feeling of how useful you found it and how much the content has benefited you. So I will be sending that via Eventbrite. So the training resources, as mentioned, will be made available as free source downloads. So the examples of the orientation wheel, the proposed templates, the checklist, the slides from today, the recording, that they will be all made available from our website. Train-the-trainer regional pilots are planned between this year and next in partner regions, so they may be in your local language, and it might be worth perhaps attending a local version of this workshop. So thank you very much. I know this was a lot of information to take on in a very short space of time, and not say a simple and easy topic either. Feel free to get in touch with me. My details are here, and also the W Power project. The website, Facebook, and our LinkedIn group details are here, so feel free to connect via any of those. Thank you very much for listening.